Yes, well, welcome. Today I would like to share with you new computational methods that I am developing to transform service robots from simple drones that are explicitly tasked and commanded into intelligent teammates that can anticipate the needs of their fellow humans. I'm going to start today with presenting some prior work that I did in my master's thesis that really, I think, is a case in point to motivate some of the challenges that we have in scheduling, to translate techniques that are developed in a theoretical setting that are good and have good properties into practical applications that have domain-specific criteria. I'm going to propose a new technique that I've developed, apprenticeship scheduling, that rather than sending in an army of consultants to interview domain experts and codify their knowledge, we're actually able to get a computer to watch these domain experts work and make the decisions that they do in the factories, in the field, and be able to interpret a model, to infer a model for how they make those decisions automatically, rather than using interviews to get that information. Third, I'm going to present a new technique, COVAS, collaborative optimization by apprenticeship scheduling, that allows us to leverage the knowledge of the human domain expert, good but imperfect, to actually produce globally optimal scheduling solutions, much more efficiently than you would through standard optimization techniques. Fourth, I'm going to show you how you can actually embed this technology within a robotic platform to provide both decision support, as also to collaborate physically with the human counterparts. And fifth, I'm going to explore some more human factors issues that arise when introducing autonomous scheduling technique into a human-robot setting. Start with one example. This is a Boeing 747. Requires 1 million bolt holes to be drilled. That's just the bolt holes. Every minute of downtime in assembling a 737 costs $100,000 of revenue per minute. This problem of scheduling, deciding who is going to do what and when, can be readily formulated as a mathematical program, where you have binary decision variables, x and j, for deciding whether task I should come before or after another task, j. Task can be drilling, riveting, fastening, or painting. We have task allocation variables that decide whether task I should be assigned to agent A or not. And then we have the start and finish times of each task. Those are our decision variables. In general, we want to minimize the make span, or the overall process duration, plus perhaps some application-specific criteria. We want to assign one task, we want to assign one worker to each task. We want to then make sure that we adhere to weight or precedence constraints. For example, if you want to apply paint to an aerospace body, you need to apply one coat of paint, wait 30 minutes, then apply a second coat of paint. We have deadline constraints that mean that, for example, when you pull a composite material out of a refrigerator, you have a finite amount of time before that composite warms up and hardens, and that you're no longer able to use that in the construction of the aerospace fuselage. Each agent works at its own rate. Two humans could be more or less proficient at the same set of tasks. Or you could have robots that have completely different end effectors. One could be for drilling and one could be fastening and not be able to work on the same set of tasks. Workers can only do one thing at a time, like most humans. And then we have physical constraints. This is actually the key challenge in our scheduling problems, because we can no longer decouple the problem. Each worker can no longer decide on their own which tasks they're going to perform, because when they come up with their schedule, it's likely that they'll end up wanting to be at the same place at the same time. There needs to be some negotiation of where these workers are going to be and which resources they're going to use. And typically when you have 10 workers in the order of hundreds of tasks as you do in manufacturing, you actually have the key bottleneck being in sequencing, the ordering of those tasks. So how would we alleviate that? So in my master's thesis, what I did was to actually develop a novel schedulability test that tells you at each moment in time when you're making scheduling commitments whether you'll be successful. It'll give you a yes if you should be able to make that commitment, and then you can proceed. And then for the task allocation, deciding who's going to do what, we use Ron Wilcox actually formulated an approximate task allocation subroutine that approximately balances the work across all the workers. So you can actually take these two subroutines into an algorithm which we call Tercio. You generate an assignment of who's going to do which tasks, and then you ask through the schedulability test whether or not that sequencing will be successful. If it is, then you can dispatch it and go ahead and produce the work. Otherwise, you can get a new task assignment and then ask if that one will be satisfied through the sequencing. How well does it work? Well, what we actually found is that it's greatly able to outperform a mixed machine learning program in terms of computation time. Well, that's good. You can make something fast, but that doesn't mean it's going to be good. Milk here, for example, the benchmark solving that long set of equations times out at about 36 tasks and 4 workers. Beyond that, you're not really able to come up with a schedule to find something feasible within a number of hours. So it's fast, but actually it's also near optimal empirically. We were able to find that it was within about 10% of the optimal solutions for all the problems that we were able to test. And at this point I thought, okay, cool, a synthetic problem, but does that actually mean anything? Well, we actually got to work with a student, Jason Herrera, who went out to Boeing and used our software against a proprietary technique, Aurora, which Boeing pays millions of dollars for. And we were able to outperform it in terms of how long it would take to complete the schedule by about 20% of all problems tested. And I didn't get those millions of dollars from Boeing. That would have been nice. So hey, this is pretty cool. And actually, as Julie mentioned, it is currently out in Everett, Washington, scheduling the work of these Cooper robots. Very cool. Okay, so what did we have to do to get it from this theoretical schedulability test to an actual application? There were a number of challenges in translating. If you remember, we started with wanting to minimize the overall process duration, but Boeing, through interviews, we found out that they also wanted to minimize the number of changes from one schedule to the next. If something went wrong, you were going to violate a deadline constraint, you'd have to reschedule the work. You want to make as few changes as possible because the logistics of retasking everyone is difficult. Okay, and then they also wanted to minimize the number of interfaces between agents. What are interfaces? If you have robots that are calibrated to a specific location in the fuselage, there's going to be a bias, a little bit to the left or right. If you have two robots that are going to paint, they may have a gap in their work or an overlap. That is not desirable for an aerospace assembly. You can imagine paint's not so bad, but drilling, a little bit worse. So then we would have to tune these coefficients, C1 and C2, that give you the relative importance of those terms relative to the mixing. Not that straightforward, but okay, it's still within this mathematical formulation you can plug in. But if you remember, because of the computational bottleneck for sequencing, we decided to approximately solve the task application component using a heuristic formulation to balance the work across all the workers, and then use my schedulability test for the sequencing. Okay, the sequencing, though, only tells you yes, or I don't know whether or not you'll succeed. It's a sufficient criteria, not necessary. So you have this yes or I don't know, but you still have to know what's the best order to do your tasks, and that's application specific. So we found that introducing these rules are feature-based, so you can use these as features to get from your experts to minimize, for example, resource potential. You don't want multiple people trying to be at the same place at the same time. We also want to make sure, for example, that we're satisfying our deadlines and making sure that work that has to come before other work is being proceeded on quickly. And then we also don't want robots spooling across the entire length of the fuselage. Even though the time it takes to actually do the drilling is much greater than the time it would take to move, you still just don't want large equipment moving across the factory quickly. So why am I going through this laundry list? Application-specific criteria makes it very difficult to scale the expertise of the researcher, in this case me. But this happens across the world, and that typically you see an army of consultants to get these application-specific criteria, have to modify your algorithm, pull it all in, and hope it works. And you end up with a product that unfortunately typically only works in one domain. And it's worse. So actually this is a helpful taxonomy by Corsaw it's all published in IJRR, in which they said for problems with complex dependencies and where it matters the way in which you perform your work, there's actually no well-known mathematical formulation for those types of problems, for the types of problems in which the way in which you do the work matters. So there's no standard technique, and you have to interview from experts. Not ideal. So what did I propose a technique called Apprenticeship Scheduling. In this framework, we actually watch domain experts making the decisions, coming up with the schedules as they do every day in the factories, learning their rules of thumb and heuristics from those observations. Then we can embed that within a computational framework to actually go beyond the power of the domain expert to actually provide perfect or globally optimal solutions given the criteria we have. And then we can either provide autonomous decisions for task execution, for example, in manufacturing, where you might have great control over the robotic facilities, or in a domain where you need a human in the loop, for example, in delivering babies, you may still want to nurse in the loop. We can then provide decision support or intelligent teaming to work alongside of the human workers. So let's start with apprenticeship scheduling. There's a number of fantastic fields that I've kind of drawn upon. I like the intersection for the work that I do. What we've shown so far in my prior work has been in multi-agent planning and scheduling. This is using mathematical criteria. You take a set of agents and a set of jobs and want to optimally assign tasks to those agents to complete them in the least amount of time, for example. Within human-loop decision-making, what the goal is to actually develop an intelligent interface that allows humans to reason about their problem and to actually come up with the solution themselves. So you turn knobs to perhaps adjust the coefficients of the objective function criteria or perhaps rearrange tasks. You're not actually learning anything from people necessarily, you're just trying to solicit good decisions from them. And then in data-driven model learning, it's a very broad term, but specifically within the idea of getting a policy from a person, learning how to mimic or imitate them. The goal is to take in information, observations of their actions, and come up with a model that explains that behavior. And I, along with Barry and Small, lay in kind of this intersection, but there's an important difference that I want to point out in our work. Barry and Small developed a scheduling system called P-Time. The goal over about a decade of work was to come up with a mechanism that would automatically schedule meetings for you and your colleagues, according to your preference. You would give out these lengthy forms to solicit your preferences, and then you would use that in a quadratic optimization formulation to solve for a solution. And unfortunately, after about 10 years of work, only about 60% of the decisions were ever accepted by the scheduling system. They gave some helpful points for why they think this was so. First, they believe that a personal assistant must build trust. Theirs did not. Second, an assistant agent must need to support rather than replace the user's natural process. I think it unlikely that a mill is how our brains think and are the flow that we want to go through. But the point, nonetheless, that you need to be able to capture the way in which people are making decisions. So, if we need to be able to learn from demonstration, one content week is inverse reinforcement learning. And the work here by Bill and Ing back in 2004, you were actually able to learn from demonstrations of users driving a car in simulation how to drive a car on a highway. But if we think about scheduling problems, let's look at key decision variables for assigning agents to tasks and ordering those tasks in time. Perhaps we have a hospital scenario where we have 10 workers, each of whom have to take care of 10 patients, and those patients have 3 stages or tasks that need to be completed for their care. The computational complexity of task allocation is 2 to the number of agents times the number of tasks, and the ordering is 2 to the number of tasks squared. That ends up giving you approximately 2 to 125,000, which is grossly intractable, especially considering that we're not even talking about the important state space variables that you need to encode for which decisions are good versus bad. So for example, how old the patient is, what the status of their labor is, their heart rate, their blood pressure, their comorbidities. Yet, even if we could approximately solve this, which there are fantastic techniques for approximately solving this, you may know AlphaGo, using approximate learning techniques. Unfortunately, it's typically not applied to scheduling. The little work that is done in reinforcement learning for scheduling assumes that tasks that are independent don't have constraints that relate them. For example, weight constraints or deadline constraints. It's very difficult to encode that in a markup decision process or an approximate framework. And so that's why people in scheduling typically rely on extension learning and programming, which I said before, limits you in your ability to scale as well because of the number of states. So the point is that state-space enumeration techniques that rely on state-based enumeration and exploration are unfortunately difficult to use in scheduling problems. So, what can we do instead? When someone comes up with a schedule, what you generally have is something like a Gantt chart, where you have an assignment of who's going to do what and when through time. And your goal then is to learn a set of rules to explain how that Gantt chart or schedule is constructed. What do we know? At each moment in time, you can see what somebody did, what action they took, was task they scheduled, and the corresponding set of actions they did not take. We also know the relevant features of their problem. For example, in that Boeing problem that I described earlier, some of those features could be the number of scheduling changes, the number of workers in a single location. You can get those features, But time and time again, researchers found that you're unable to get an accurate model of how those experts use those features to come up with a policy. You can get the features, what they're reason about, but it's hard to get how they use those features to solve a problem. So, it's very interesting to think about this in terms of an analogy of web page ranking, where instead of deciding at any moment in time what's the most relevant task that you would want to schedule given the state of the environment, what's the most relevant web page given the query of the user. There are three techniques in general within web page ranking. Point-wise actually says, let's consider each web page independently and give it a rating of how relevant it is and try to learn a model to predict that rating. Point-wise says, give me two web pages and predict which one is more important than the other, more relevant. And third, list-wise, which will give you an entire set of web pages. This is helpful, for example, if you want to search for cat, you might need a furry creature, or you might need a caterpillar tractor. If you remember what I told you, you know which action was taken by the user and the corresponding set of actions not taken. It actually lends itself very well to a pairwise approach, where you want to learn a classification rule to tell you why one action was taken and another one was not by the user. This is how it looks. Let's consider we have a scheduled task, tau I, and we have a feature vector that describes that task. These features can include, for example, the deadline, where it happens in time and space, the agent working on it, and then we also have a set of feature vectors describing the set of actions not taken. And we get these features from the domain experts themselves and give that to the computer algorithm. And then we want to construct pairwise comparisons between the scheduled task, or the feature vector of the scheduled task, and the feature vector of the unscheduled tasks. We do this first. We take the feature vector of the scheduled action, subtract from it the feature vector of the first unscheduled action. That'll be a positive example. We do the opposite. For the negative example, we take the feature vector of the action, the first action not taken, subtract from it the feature vector of the first action of the action taken. And that's a negative example. But what am I missing? This gamma sub tau here. There are certain features in this machine learning problem that are contextual in nature, that are common to all tasks. So for example, if the domain expert might use about the percent of agents that are idle, or the total number of agents that are idle in making a decision, if you encode that number as a scalar in this vector, and you subtract it from the same point in another vector, you end up with 0. You lose that information. So we preserve, as this pointwise term, the features that are common to all tasks. And you can get that information from the domain experts themselves. So you do that for the first unscheduled action and the scheduled action to get our first set of examples. And likewise, we repeat this for all other actions at each moment in time. And through that, we can then train a classification rule, f-rank, that takes in two tasks or actions, tau I and tau x, and gives you a probability between 0 and 1 of I being more important than x, or being the one that it thinks that the domain expert would choose. If you then sum over all x, you can get a cumulative importance of action I, and then taking the R max over I will give you overall what action it thinks that the domain expert would have picked at that point in time. What are some benefits to this approach? First, most easily, you can readily apply standard classification techniques you've used for a vector machine, a decision tree, neural network. And that's very helpful. You don't need to come up with a new loss function, a new algorithm to learn this classifier. Although you could if it was insufficient. Second, you don't actually need to solicit the rankings of tasks. You don't need to ask the domain expert, you chose this one, but why not this one? Why not this one? Why not this one? You actually are able to just infer that by watching what they did relative to what they did not do. Third, it's non-parametric in the number of tasks. Because you're only ever considering 2 actions at a time, it doesn't matter whether you train on a task set with 10 actions or 20. You can apply that to a task set with 15 or 25 actions, theoretically speaking, because it's not dependent necessarily on the number of actions that you have available. And fourth, you actually have more training in this. So something like policy grading would look at each moment in time as a single time step, whereas what I'm actually able to do is use, if we have n actions, we have 2 times n minus 1 observations. So we're essentially for 2 times the number of possible actions you could take in each moment in time is the amount of extra data we're getting from each observation, which is great for training, especially because as you make a larger feature vector you have, it becomes more difficult with less data. Okay, so we have this theoretical technique, but does it actually work? that span two of the most difficult classes of problems in the scheduling literature, the human reliable scheduling literature. The first would be a synthetic data set looking at job shop scheduling and multiple vehicle routing problems. This is kind of like what FedEx solves every day or what Boeing does. We're going to look at two real-world data sets, the first being one of anti-ship missile defense, where a tactical action officer has to decide how to protect his or her own ship, given this threat of set of missiles that are coming in, anti-ship missiles coming to destroy his or her own ship. And then also an example from obstetrics and labor and delivery, and how the charge nurse on the labor and delivery floor runs air traffic control for labor and delivery. So first, let's look at the vehicle routing problem. I constructed a synthetic data set, one that I could well understand, with a mock expert. I came up with my own mock expert to schedule a set of vehicle routing problems that we included time windows for deliveries that would come at least after this certain amount of time in the day and before another certain amount of time in the day. We also included weight constraints, so some houses would have to be visited before others. And we also included resource constraints. So for example, two trucks cannot be at the same place at the same time. And then we enumerated a data set of this mock expert applying one of a set of scheduling rules to these problems that it thought was best to apply. So we have to then reverse engineer using the Apprenticeship Scheduling algorithm this hybrid dynamical rule set that the mock expert used. And when I applied the Apprenticeship Scheduling technique with pairwise ranking, using a decision tree as my classifier, what we actually found is that here, we're going to look at the sensitivity and to the right, the specificity. Sensitivity here means that given the user took an action, or the mock expert, took an action, did you correctly predict that an action was taken, and did you pick the right action from that set of actions? We have 20 possible actions you could take here in this example. Specificity means that given that no action was taken, did you schedule problems because of the interplay of lower bound temporal constraints and upper bound temporal constraints as well, weight constraints and deadlines. So if you see here on the x-axis, we varied the number of demonstrations that was given to the machine learning algorithm, the Apprenticeship Scheduling algorithm. And then here, depth-wise, we actually varied the proportion of those demonstrations from our mock expert that were correct. So for example, we see in blue, we said that 80% of the time, the mock expert would take the correct scheduling action. And 20% of the time, it would choose an action at random. We used IID, random variable, to decide whether or not there would be a mistake made. And what's really helpful is that even with a single scheduling demonstration, that means that you scheduled the entire set of work to be completed, and only 20%, and only 80% of the work, the actions chosen that were correct, we're already at about 61% of a model recovered. And that quickly goes up to 80% with only 5 schedules and 90% correct scheduling demonstrations, which I feel is really, I was really excited when I was able to see these results. And it's actually a bit easier here. And why is that? It's easier to decide not to take action. Why? Because here, you have to have a 50-50 chance of deciding to take the action, and you actually have to choose 1 out of 20 to get the right scheduling action. So the chances of getting it by random chance would only be 3%. But here, random guessing will get you 50% already. So this is 3% versus 82%. So we're able to learn an accurate model that's somewhat robust to the number of demonstrations and how noisy those demonstrations are, but does it actually translate to a real-world application? Let's consider anti-ship missile defense. In this application, we have a tactical action officer that is on board a ship and has to decide how to lay down a set of decoys or countermeasures, such as flare, chaff, or perhaps even a UAV, to mitigate the threat of incoming enemy anti-ship missiles. A one-to-one problem where you have to defeat only one missile with perhaps one interceptor is relatively easy. You can just fire one that's coming in. But when you have a complex interplay between multiple enemy anti-ship missiles, they may be looking for different heat signature, radar emissions, as well as countermeasures that can affect multiple missiles. It becomes very difficult. The Navy doesn't currently have a doctrine for how to do this. And so we said, why can't we have tactical action officers, experts in anti-ship missile defense, solve this problem in a serious game and try to learn a policy from that? And this is that very serious game developed with the Laboratory and Pipeworks Studios under the Office of Naval Research. There's an aircraft carrier and there's what's known as a moth missile because it's looking for heat. That's something on the aircraft carrier. We have a cruiser that will, or a destroyer that will actually launch flares and then send a UAV over here to try and distract that incoming enemy missile. And then you move the destroyer to the right to try and make sure that after it overflies the flare, it won't then turn and then hit the ship. So it's a very complex dynamic environment. And we collected a data set that involved 5 different types of decoys with 10 different types of missiles and 16 total game configurations. A game configuration would be a laydown of which enemy missiles, of which types are going to be flying from which angles and at which time. We had a data set of 162 games played by 27 human ASMB experts, and we trained our apprenticeship scheduling model on those 16 demonstrations, the perfect one from each of those. So there was a human that was able to achieve a perfect demonstration in each of those 16, but on average, they were not perfect. We trained on the cream of the crop of the demonstrations, and what do we find? Using link 1 out cost validation, meaning that you train on the 15 that you had and test on the one that you held out, we were actually able to find that the average human player achieved a score of about 75,000, which roughly translates to 2 missiles impacting the ship. The learned model's average was 88,000, which translates to about 1 missile impacting the ship. And while this isn't a perfect score, which would have been about 105,000, this is actually better than what the average of even the demonstrators that got a perfect score some of the time. And this performance is statistically significantly different. That we're able to the apprenticeship scheduling technique is able to outperform the average human on the majority of scheduling scenarios. Okay, so maybe it works in anti-ship missiles, but what about labor and delivery? Quite a different thing. Well, maybe. So here you see a labor and delivery form. To the right is the manual dashboard where you see information for about 30 patients, 1 row for each patient, and we have columns describing each of those patients. We have then LCD displays for the fetal heart rate tracings of patients, the contraction pressure of the mother, and perhaps even the heart rate of the mother themselves. And then we have one sole individual, the charge nurse, the resource nurse, that's responsible for making sure that the right patient is in the right room at the right time, that the right nurses and doctors are there to care for them. There's 6 types of rooms, 4 different types of nursing roles, and it's all up to her. And it's quite challenging. It's in terms of the volume, it can be considered more complex than air traffic control at certain times. And she has no teller. So I asked, what could we do for a robot to help us? Well, with Nicole CEO, an undergrad working with me, she's now at IBM Watson, I shadowed actually Dr. Shaw, who's here, for a couple of years, getting to see deliveries, see the workflow of both the obstetricians, gynecologists, and the nurses themselves. And we developed a high-fidelity simulation of the labor delivery floor. You can see it here. Don't worry if you can't read it, it's really ugly. The point is that this is better than what they have right now, which is nothing. And through this, we actually had resource nurses play the simulation and collect decisions that they would make as if it were a real labor delivery floor. And we could use that to then train our apprenticeship scheduling algorithm. Here is just a crop out of a section of the decision tree rule set that I've learned for how to assign patients to rooms. The actual decision tree is much larger. This is just a subset. That'll tell you how to assign new patients to rooms. And we had the robot now offer advice to these nurses based upon the policy and ask them to decide whether or not that was acceptable advice. Here's an example. What we found was actually, with only a few hours of training data from expert charge nurses, we were already able to get 90% of advice accepted by those nurses on the labor delivery floor, showing that we can learn a high-quality model. And I'll tell you that I don't think it's possible necessarily to get to 100% because of the inter-operator disagreement. So how often do you think nurses would agree with each other? It's probably not 100% of the time. Okay. So far, I've shown you the need to develop an apprenticeship scheduling technique to be able to learn from demonstration the rules of thumb and heuristics of domain experts and put that into a policy. But it's limited by the quality of the technique are the demonstrations of those experts. If they make mistakes, that's into the model. And what I've essentially done so far is known as dead reckoning. Policy learning is essentially dead reckoning, where at each moment in time, as you would start at a starting location and try to work your way to a metaphorical goal, you would make decisions, and that over time can add up to a large cumulative error that you can wander away from the intended goal because you don't have a feedback of where you're trying to get to. But on the other hand, goal-based reasoning, such as the mixed learning program and inverse reinforcement learning that I was showed you earlier, is limited in terms of its scalability because you have to search through the space to find the optimal solution. And so what I propose instead is to actually bridge these techniques, to actually use policy learning to then inform the way in which you search through an environment to find an optimal solution. And that's where we have collaborative optimization via Apprenticeship Scheduling, or COVAS. The idea is that we take in scheduling demonstrations, just as before, to train a policy using apprenticeship scheduling to decide which action should be taken at each moment in time. We've taken a new problem, run our decision rule to construct a new schedule, and with that new schedule, we then feed it into a mixed integer linear program, where we solicit the rules, the constraints of the problem from those domain experts. So for example, in tissue missile defense, you can solicit the dynamics of how missiles fly. And we have a goal, for example, in tissue missile defense, don't die. We can use this new solution from apprenticeship scheduling to do a few things. First, the quality of the solution, the objective function score, actually serves as a lower bound on the actual solution, the optimal solution. This lower bound, in conjunction with an upper bound, which you can solve through an LP relaxation of the mixed interlinear formulation, gives you then an upper and lower bound that you can iteratively tighten until you find the optimal solution. Further, using the actual solution of the apprenticeship schedule, you get what's known as an incumbent solution to seed the start, that you can use local search heuristics such as hill climbing or simulated kneeling to then iteratively improve that and get iteratively better lower bounds. And then hopefully you'll find the true optimal solution. And so using this, we can more intelligently search through the branch and bound search space and avoid searching portions of the area that are unhelpful, where you would find a poor quality solution. How does it actually work? We apply it to anti-ship missile defense, where there's a clear objective function to survive. And we ask, how well could it do head-to-head against a human demonstrator? And when you use a benchmark, which is a pure mixed linear program, uninformed by apprenticeship scheduling, versus our technique, COVAS, it only takes a few seconds to be able to get a solution that's better than the human demonstrators themselves, using the lead one out cross-validation. So that's great. It actually takes about 60 seconds to get the demonstration from the human, so we're here using that to get a solution within a few seconds. That's better than the human on average. And then in terms of the entire time to find the optimal solution, we're about 5 times faster than an uninformed optimization approach. Okay, so we think we can use this to improve the computation time to find the actual globally optimal solution. We can do it to have a solution better, but what does that actually mean for us? Well, if you train on a problem where you actually have 10 missiles that you have to defeat, I ask, can we actually then apply that to problems with 15 or 20 or more missiles to actually then to scale the expertise of the domain expert beyond the problems that they're actually providing as a solution. And when you compare it to a mixed linear program that's uninformed, COVAS is able to solve problems in order of magnitude faster than uninformed optimization, and do so for problems twice as large as those provided by the human domain experts during demonstrations. So we trained at 10 missiles and we applied it at 20 missiles so that we can transfer this knowledge. And it's quite incredible that we're able to do that, given that we're only training on a smaller data set of a different number of missiles and applying that to a larger one. We're able to really scale the power of the domain experts. It was actually, I presented some of these results to somebody in the Navy who provides these demonstrations. And when he saw this, he said, well, like, okay, maybe we're okay, we'll provide some benefit. And he saw this setting and he said, oh no, I'm going to lose my job. And I'm like, no, you're not going to lose your job. I need you to teach my algorithm how to solve the problems. And then I can use your knowledge to then get a better solution than what you could have done. Okay, so we visited how to learn rules of thumbs from the domain experts, how we can use that to improve optimization to perhaps apply autonomous decision-making in manufacturing military applications. But what about a setting of the human in the loop? How would we actually embody apprenticeship scheduling within a robot? What is the system that we need to develop? Well, I actually thought there's a more important question. Should we do this? Is a robot the right method to provide this decision support? I established a set of hypotheses based on prior work in human-robot interaction. There's a very interesting set of work that shows that when you put an algorithm onto a robotic platform, because it's more anthropomorphic and lifelike, people trust it more. There's an example from Tercio Research Institute where they had people go into a simulated burning building, and there was a robot that would seemingly guide them out of it. Unfortunately, the robot would actually guide them into a closet. What people did, though, was to follow the robot into the closet. The robot would turn around, try to put the lights out to say, I'm broken, and people just stayed there. They didn't try to rescue themselves. I don't want nurses to blindly trust my robot, but there is some evidence that when working with domain experts, that trend may not be true. There was actually an investigation with diabetes patients who were not swayed by the degree to which an agent is anthropomorphic. So, what we want if we're going to use a robot that we hope eventually will help with physical tasks of moving patients sitting up in a room, perhaps even being a scrub nurse, we want to make sure that these subjects appropriately comply with it. That means that when there's bad advice, that you are rejecting that bad advice, that you appropriately rely on that, which means that you want to view false alarms. That means that if it's actually good advice, you don't want to be rejecting good advice from the robot. And you also want to appropriately trust in that system. We don't want you to trust the robot way more than you trust a computer. And then finally, we do want, if you're going to work with the robot, that you like working with the robot more than a computer-based decision support system. The first two of these are objective measures, and then trust will be measured subjectively. So what do you find? Appropriate reliance with few false alarms. Well, what we can do is actually vary the advice call of the decision support system, giving good or bad advice to measure how well you reject or accept that advice. And what we find is that if you prime somebody on good advice in one condition, and then you give them the next set of good advice, the rate in which they reject that advice is actually much less for the computer support system. So what does this look like? The false alarms overall for a computer-based decision support system, where you're incorrectly rejecting good advice, is much higher for the computer than for the robot. Second, the number of false alarms, the number of times that you reject good advice, after you've been primed on bad advice, is actually statistically significantly greater for the computer-based decision support system. Further, the number of misses, that means that when you fail to reject bad advice, the most dangerous information, it's highest when you've been primed on good advice and then you transition to bad advice for a computer-based decision support system, where 18%. And further, when you're working with a computer-based decision support system, when you're primed on bad versus good advice, the difference between the number of misses that you have increases greatly for the computer-based decision support system. So what does this mean so far? That you're less engaged with the computer-based decision support system, and you're less reticent to identify the quality of advice that's being given to you when you're working with a computer. There's something about a robot that makes you pay attention to the quality of the advice, and you're not swayed by whether the previous advice was good or bad. Well, how about in terms of trust? We actually found that this carries through to subjective measures as well. That actually we found that subjects across the measures shown with the blue arrows there, that your trust in a computer-based decision support system, whether the advice is bad or good, is about this different. But when working with a robotic system, when it has bad advice, your trust is about here, and when it's good advice, your trust is up here. And anecdotally working with these subjects, I wish I had videotaped to show you that actually the subjects, when the robot gave good advice, were praising it. They loved it. And when it gave bad advice, they weren't going to throw it away and leave it to a wall. But with the computer, they're like, oh, it's just a computer system. They weren't as engaged. But what about in terms of preferring to work with the robot? We actually found across these measures that subjects were more likely to want to work with robotic agent, and there wasn't a single measure for which they preferred working with a computer-based decision support system. So we believe that both subjective and objective evidence supports the use of a robotic-based decision support system over a computer-based system, at least for domain experts and labor delivery. So now that I think it's okay for us to use a robotic system over a computer one, how do we actually make it happen? Well, in working with a number of undergraduate students as well as Brad Hayes, we developed a full robotic system that had a computer vision subroutine, that was what Brad worked on, to be able to parse in information from the whiteboard that I showed you earlier with the rows of columns, to collect the state of the scheduling environment. We used the apprenticeship scheduling algorithm that I developed, trained on domain experts, the charge nurses, as well as a natural language processing subroutine CMU Sphinx, to be able to listen to requests from the charge nurses and be able to respond with advice. What does it look like? I can't believe they let us do that. And here's some helpful quotes from people that work with the robotic system. I think it's really interesting in particular. One of the doctors who had worked with a number of nurses at different hospitals actually found that the decision-making process of domain experts, even though they are experts, can be swayed perhaps by favoritism or other criteria that one would not call optimal. And that doing the process in which you codify this knowledge and learn this knowledge in a rule-based system, such as Apprenticeship Scheduling, could actually provide more equitable assignments and do a better job. And also, this could be used as a training tool, giving good advice or bad advice and asking new nurses to identify whether that's good or bad advice and using that as a mechanism for training, which is pretty cool. But embodiment is one of many human factors topics. I'm not going to get to talk about all of them. But I want to talk about situational awareness, workload, and workflow preferences. Through a series of human subject experiments, I invited participants to come work on our human-robot team, where the subject could either build or fetch. The human confederate would either be able to build or fetch, and the robot could only fetch. And we would vary who would be responsible for scheduling decisions. Either the human participant would be responsible, or the robot would be fully responsible, or there's a middle condition in which the human participant would decide which tasks he wanted to do, and the robot would decide how to allocate the remaining tasks between the robot and the human confederate, which was often Gina Carla. Thank you. First, we looked at situational awareness, which can be defined by the esteemed Inslee as situational awareness is the perception of the elements of the environment within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and projection of their status in the near future. It's basically you need to know what's happening, have an understanding of it, and being able to project and simulate into the future what that will mean to be able to make good decisions now. What happens if the robotic decision support system fails and you now have to take over the decision-making process? You need to have a good situational awareness. Well, unfortunately, having high situational awareness is often mutually exclusive with introducing a highly autonomous decision support system. And we found this in the lab, actually, with working with Anna Bear, that looking at the ability to recall when you stop the experiment in midstream and you ask people, what was the current action everyone was doing? What was the preceding action? What are all preceding actions? And what is going to happen in the future? When you have them working with the autonomous agent, they're making many more mistakes at recalling that information. And that's despite giving them time to review the schedule that the robot created. There's something about the human constructing their schedule themselves, not simply just reading the schedule, that allows them to recall information better. We see this as well as subjective measures in terms of their confidence, that when they construct the schedule themselves, they're much more confident in their ability to reconstruct that information. So we believe that situational awareness decreases with increasing autonomy. So in future work, if you're going to have robotic decision support systems later delivery, you want to make sure that the human is in the loop making decisions, lest they lose situational awareness. In terms of workflow preferences, two teams out at Boeing may complete the same task but do so in completely different ways. You need to understand the way in which work is done. When conducting a human server experiment where we ask people, do you prefer to actually complete building tasks or fetching tasks? Those are the two types of tasks we have. They often prefer to build. Unfortunately, for the team dynamic, it's better for the humans to assist in fetching. So what that ended up meaning is that when the robot did the opposite of what humans wanted, that's when they were given the most work to do. That ended up having the team be most productive. And we actually found a strong correlation with subjective experience that the more work they were given, regardless of their preferences, the more happy they were with the team's performance. And so maybe giving them what they want isn't what they actually want. And so when you actually tease these two components out to separately vary the amount of work that you give to somebody and whether or not you adhere to their preferences, then you're able to find, yes, they want you, across all of these measures, you can find that they want you to adhere to their workflow preferences, but they don't want it to come at the expense of you utilizing them effectively in the team. They want the team to succeed. So across these experiments, what we found is that embodiment appears to solicit better rates of appropriate trust, reliance, and compliance with the decision support or robotic decision support system. Second, to improve situational awareness, we want to keep the human engaged with the robotic decision support system and not just turn over the reins to that robot. And third, there's a complex interplay between the workload and the workflow preferences of the team. So, getting through this, what we found first is that there's a need to develop an apprenticeship scheduling technique that's able to learn the rules of thumb from domain experts, to put that into a policy that can then imitate the decision-making process. We can use that to inform an optimization search to find a globally optimal solution, taking good but imperfect demonstrations from domain experts to be able to provide globally optimal solutions faster than uninformed optimization, and either provide autonomous decision-making in certain domains where that's appropriate, as well as a human factors understanding of how to include the human in the loop for these human-robot teams. Today I've shared with you a new computational technique for apprenticeship scheduling that I've developed and formulated using pairwise ranking techniques to learn from scheduling demonstration how to imitate the decision-making process of domain experts. Formulated COVAS, which is able to take that information, leverage that policy to provide globally optimal solutions more quickly than uninformed optimization. I've been embodied apprenticeship scheduling with robotic decision support systems, showing first that you can actually demonstrate, we demonstrated on the delivery floor that this could be done, and what the human factors consequences of that are, as well as I've developed a better understanding of situational awareness, workload, and workflow preferences, in a lab that can help inform the design of these systems. So, I think in our lab we have a de facto rule that you get one acknowledgement slide for each year that you've done in the lab. I'm rounding up to 6. First, I'd like to thank all my fantastic collaborators and sponsors. Many of the team have representation here today. Of course, thank MIT Lincoln Laboratory for taking me for a couple summers and allowing me to work with this fantastic condition missile defense data set. OA for supporting work EW and human factors subject experiments, Office of Naval Research for sponsoring military work, CRICO for funding all the work in the hospital, as well as Beth Israel for actually letting me be an employee and walk around in scrubs. Okay. Julie. I want to thank Julie very much for being how do we say, perhaps an academic mother of sorts, to be able to raise me from basically this fledgling bachelor of science, into what I hope is a capable and academic adult, having to pay my academic bills and peer review. And I wouldn't have had any of the opportunities that I would have if I hadn't come to Julie. The sun of Stanford was not enough to keep me away from working with Julie. Whether it's allowing me to work on a Boeing project and actually flying me to Everett to be able to take time to have my algorithm work on a real robot, which is unbelievable. Being able to shelter me from some of the challenges of departmental considerations and frays that arise over the years, and allowing me to work with her husband on the labor floor and disappear for many days on end to work with nurses, and just giving me those opportunities. I can't imagine that happening just about anywhere else. And I truly believe that Julie is one of my willing advisors to support her students. She will allow you to stand on her shoulders and do more than I think I could have ever imagined getting to do. So I'm truly grateful to Julie and the support she's given me to realize my dreams and things that were too cool for me to even dream of about 6 years ago. I want to thank my fantastic committee members, Wilgate Lulu, as well as Andrea Tomas, who are on the phone at University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of Texas, for mentoring me, shaping me, giving me support outside the lab. They've been wonderful support from me, as well as Hansa Christian, who is here, and Peter Solovitz. Both of you have been able to give me a rigorous assessment of my work that I've been really grateful for. Thank you to some at MIT Lincoln Laboratory who came into Julie's office one day and said, I have a cool problem, and Julie said, oh, I think I have a student here. And linked me up, and Sun's been a fantastic mentor, always giving me an honest assessment. And Dr. Laura Hyatt in the Research Lab, who I got to meet through the doctoral consortium, and a fantastic critique of my thesis, and has been able to support me just in a way that I think goes beyond what the duties of a thesis reader are. So Matthew, why on earth did you have 7 people on your committee? That's a lot of people to organize and schedule. Well, for me, I said, this is the one time in my life where I'd ever be able to assemble the Avengers of academia. And that's what I believe I did. I want to thank Dr. Neil Shaw, as well as Dr. Tony Nolan, who allowed me to shadow them on the labor floor for giving me access to things that I would never been able to explore, really developing me a passion for women and fetal health. Postdocs Brad Hayes and Jesse Yang. Jesse is now a professor at the University of Michigan who helped with the hospital project, as well as some fantastic undergrads who I've gotten to work with. And IRG, the Interactive Robotics Group, which has taken on so many different faces over the years. It's been a warm home for me, and thank you for all your support, our coffee hours, and muffin Mondays. I want to thank all of my friends who've come from church. Thank you for your warm support. You have literally prayed over me and married me. The pastor who actually married us is here. So thank you. Thank God for all of you, for our own family. And you've actually listened to me sing. I'm sorry. Thank my beautiful wife. I won't get too emotional now, but just thank you for her support. This is as much hers as mine. Especially passing calls with our 9-hour review of my research presentation. Thank my wonderful family who raised me, as well as my loving grandparents, and my beautiful, wonderful in-laws. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions.